For the last 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, Asian societies, and not just Asian societies, but mostly Asian society grew rich by exporting to the United States. Starting with Japan in the 50s and 60s, followed by the four dragons, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the four tigers, tiger cubs, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, followed by China and Vietnam. Of course, not restricting to these countries, but mostly, I want to specifically focus on Asian societies. But you also see in the case of Germany, Germany up until today is still exporting to US and practicing a very strong export-oriented strategy. So all of us have been exporting to the US, and all of us assume that the United States is the consumer of the last resort, and very often we assume that the United States is the consumer of the first resort. So whatever we do, we aim to export to the United States. And this is even for example, for Chinese companies that are investing in Malaysia. They are investing in Malaysia, many of them are thinking of exporting from Malaysia. But Donald Trump is shutting the front door, and Donald Trump is also shutting the back door. Right? What is clear is that the political environment in the United States is unlikely to change the direction of travel. We're now seeing Trump too. But in terms of trade policy, the direction of travel has not changed since Trump won. Because in terms of trade, the Biden administration is very similar, was practicing very similar trade policy as Trump won. So in many ways, trade policy under Biden was almost like Trump 1.5. And now you see Trump 2. What we will have to now realize is that in the long run, we cannot always think of the United States as the main export market. But beyond that, we have to ask ourselves, can we only practice an export-led strategy? Right? We are in our discussions, in our public discussions, there are many people who say that, oh, we are going to diversify our market. We're going to diversify our market. But the question is, even if you diversify the market, are there consumers? Okay? In this whole discussions, there are very few people who actually look at the demand side of the question. Right? Because in the export-led or export-oriented industrialization strategy, you don't have to worry about demand. The US will suck up all the demand. That's the original thinking. And in that strategy, most of our society has some form of financial suppressions on consumption. China has some form of financial suppressions of consumption in order to provide a lot more financial incentive for export. In our case, in the case of Malaysia, we have often been suppressing wages. We think that suppressing wages is a form of enhancing competitiveness. So in our public discourse, the moment there's some increase of wages, you will have FMM, you will have the Employers Association, you will have all sorts of noises that, increase of wages is going to erode our export competitiveness. Okay, so this is in our minds, in China, in Southeast Asia, in many of our societies. But where are the consumers if you do not export to the US? If US is not the consumer of the first and last resort? And I think this is fundamental questions that all of you, the very smart MBA students, will have to grapple with. As well as for policymakers like us, we will now have to grapple with the question, where will demand coming from? Where will demand come from? Demand, if there's no jobs, if there's no decent pay, if there's no middle class, if no one is spending, there's no demand. If there's no external demand, there's no domestic demand, then it will be a downward spiral. So my prediction is, while there may be inflation in the United States, what Trump is doing may have a bifurcated effect on the world. That means there may be inflationary impact in the United States, but elsewhere, especially in Asia, we may face a situation of deflation. Why? Because if we maintain the same level of very high productive capacity and we keep producing, yet there's no one buying, not enough people buying, we will compete to sell to each other, we will reduce the prices, we will dump, and eventually it will be a vicious cycle where companies will have to shut down, whether in China or in Southeast Asia, and jobs will be laid off, and then it will be a downward spiral. And once there is a downward spiral, we'll face a deflation. And this is where I am worried. I am worried because what we may face, using the words of President Xi Jinping, 百年未有之变局. This is maybe once in 100 years. What we are seeing is definitely the end of an 80-year global trade structure. But we may be facing a similar situation like the 1930s. The 1930s, when there was an economic crisis in 1929, subsequently the US imposed tariff, and everyone else followed by imposing tariff, and there were a series of retaliations, and followed by a series of trade war. And with trade war, the line between a trade war and war is not very far. And that's what worried me. There are many commentaries outside that says that US will face deflation, subsequently will face inflation, subsequently US will face stagflation. But there's one tool in the toolbox that Donald Trump can resort to. When there is recession in the US, Donald Trump can always resort to starting a war. And for Donald Trump to start a war, it is not beyond the realm of possibilities. And when he starts a war, when there is war production, when war production happens, there will be jobs, there will be weapons being made, there will be engineers being hired, there will be businesses. You just have to look at recently in the Financial Times, there is a piece about the war economy in Russia. Suddenly, because many soldiers died, and when soldiers died, the number of total labor force reduced. Therefore, each of the labor get higher pay because there are competitions to find more workers, to pay workers better in order to get workers, and then the government paid out money to what they call those who died in the war. Money paid to the families. Family had money to spend, and because of war production, there are productions. There are businesses and there are factories open in places that were never had factories before. But these are not sustainable, because if everyone start a war, we will enter a world war, and this world war will be more extreme and more dangerous than any previous world war, because the weaponries that we have now compared to 80 years ago are so much more advanced. Now, enough of the global situation. Back to Malaysia. With or without the Trump crisis, I think we have to do things differently. We as a nation has accepted that some ideas about ourselves, and we have somehow ingrained and accepted these ideas for the longest of time, and it's time for us to rethink how we see Malaysia. Very often you see in the papers, you see in the articulations of leaders, you see in the view of business people. They'll tell you that we are a trading nation. Malaysia is a trading nation, and Malaysia trade. Sometimes they don't tell you that they also trade people, trade human beings. So we are one of the largest, what they call human trading nation. We trade foreign workers, and some, as well as a lot of illegal foreign workers as well. But I would like to see Malaysia not just as a trading nation. And maybe this is also the wrong time to just be a trading nation. When global trade will suffer so much more challenges, we cannot just be a trading nation and seeing trade flow through without value adding. For the MBA students, you will probably know, professor would have told you, sometimes it's not so much about how much you trade, it's how much value you create and how much value you capture along the way. I would like to see Malaysia as a technology nation. I would like to see Malaysia as a technology nation, and I would like to see Malaysia seeing itself as a technology nation. If you look around the world, we will have to accept that in terms of technology, Malaysian technology would not be as advanced as China, the United States, let's say Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, France. Our technology would not be as advanced as them. And in the next 10, 15 years, we will still lag behind them. However, we work very hard. It's not easy to leapfrog against the nation I've mentioned. But think about this. Beyond these countries, Malaysian technology is actually at a very interesting level. If you have visited some of the factories that we have in Malaysia, especially in the semiconductor industry, we have very interesting technology scene. In some of our factories, we are already producing something. Some of the production that we are doing is very advanced. So we are not any other country that has no technology at all. And if you ask the Chinese, and I now see many Chinese from China, Chinese managers, Chinese CEOs from the semiconductor sectors. Let's say if they are around 50 years old or 60 years old, very likely they would have told me that when they were younger, when they were in the semiconductor sector in the 1990s or early 2000s, very likely they would have a Malaysian manager or Malaysian boss. Because Penang started the semiconductor sector in 1972. Intel's first ever overseas factory was in Penang. So Penang has a strong ecosystem for semiconductor industries, including the supporting and supplier industry, and also 2 or 3 generations of Malaysians who manage semiconductor factories. So in China back in the 90s and early 2000s, most of the semiconductor sector were managed by Malaysian managers. And there's no accident that today Broadcom is led by a Malaysian. Intel is now led by a former Malaysian. Grew up in Malaysia, born in Malaysia, grew up in Singapore. And what was the other one? Tata. Tata, I just came back from India 2 weeks ago. Tata Electronics appointed a Malaysian to run their semiconductor segment. There's no coincidence that this is because we do have very embedded and deep knowledge about technology. But we need to do more as a technology nation. We need to see ourselves as technology nation. We need to see ourselves pushing our industry away from unskilled foreign labor to move into digitalization, automation, and adoptions of AI and adoptions of digitalization. I think we need to do that. We need to do that in order to shift away from purely thinking of ourselves as a trading nation and we trade anything. We need to see ourselves as a technology nation. But where do we place ourselves? So in the book, I mentioned about 3 middle. The first middle, we should see ourselves as the indispensable middle in the global technology ladder. That means we accept that there will be some countries which will be leading in technology, and we are not able and will not supersede them in the next 10, 15 years. But we occupy an indispensable middle. That means if they want certain technology, if they want certain middle technology, if they want certain middle management know-how, we are there. And we become a very strong middle tech nation. And this ties into a global situation. The global situation is that we used to chase the top technology in order to export to the United States. And many of those technology are not indigenous technology. It is basically FDI investing here and treating Malaysia as just production site. What I want to see and what I think is good for the nation is that we will move away from just vertically integrated with the global high-tech companies, but we want to diffuse technology to other sectors in our industry. Think about this. We have very interesting semiconductor sector. When I visited the United States, when I visited Detroit in May 2023, the then US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo told a bunch of APEC ministers, Asian ministers, she said, when Malaysia shut down factories during COVID, when we locked down factories, General Motors had to shut down for an extended period of time in Detroit. Why? Because a small, well, not small, but a semiconductor factory in Muar actually produced about 30% or more of global automotive chips. Now, 10, 15 years ago, your car has very few chips. Today, an ICE car would probably have 1,000 chips, and an EV probably 3,000 or 4,000 chips. The more we move in terms of technology, automotive become a lot more driven by semiconductor. But in Malaysia, Geely or Perodua, Geely, Proton, Perodua, Daihatsu, they have not actually tapped into the capability of the semiconductor sector. Of course, our defense industry has nothing to do with semiconductor industry. Our medical devices industry has nothing to do with semiconductor industry. Our agriculture industry has never tapped into the capability of the semiconductor sector. So when I talk about middle tech, I would like to see the horizontal crossing, horizontal linkage of Malaysian technology from the semiconductor industry to diffuse to other sectors, so that every other sectors capitalize on the capability that we have in the semiconductor industry. Relating to this also, that we may not just need to think about exporting to the United States. We may have to start thinking about creating middle tech so that we can sell to Cambodia or Bangladesh or Brazil or Turkey and the neighboring countries. Of course, we may go into competition with Chinese companies. I mean, that is something that we will have to deal with. But creating middle tech for the bottom billions of world population, instead of chasing high tech to export to the top nation, I think this is something that Malaysia should think about. So that's the first middle. The next two middle, I'll make it very short. The second middle is to see Malaysia as a middle power. Now, this word is a big word in geopolitics, but it has a lot of relevance now. We are not a big country, but think about this. Switzerland has less than 10 million population. But of course, Switzerland is very, very rich, and they have quite a significant role globally. Australia has a huge land size, but Australia has a smaller population than Malaysia. But many scholars, many practitioners regard Australia as some form of a middle power. Korea has 50 million population. We have 34 million population. So population size may not be the only determination, but Korea, because of its wealth and because of its technological capability, it is often regarded also as a middle power. Now, in geopolitics, it is important that Malaysia play the role of a middle power so that we try our best to influence ASEAN and also influence the events of the world, and not just thinking about ourselves inwardly. The third middle is to create a middle class. I circle back to what I said initially. It is important to start thinking about creating consumers. Right? We mentioned about US and all this, and we noticed earlier that no one talks about who is going to consume our products. It is important that we create a middle class in Malaysia. We cannot forever suppress wages. We will have to accept that if we do not adjust the wages up, we will see many more Malaysians leaving for Singapore. I have been talking to visitors. I meet many foreigners, foreign businesses. I say, you all come from Europe or US or sometimes even Chinese from China. When you take a helicopter view of Southeast Asia, very often foreign investors look at Southeast Asia and say, oh, Southeast Asia is Singapore and everyone else. So I told them, I say, you never assume that Malaysia is just a better version of Vietnam. Malaysia is not a better version of Vietnam. When you look at Southeast Asia, you should assume that Malaysia is a Singapore at a discount. Whatever Singapore can do, actually you can do here. Maybe a bit inferior, maybe not as good. But think about this. If you pay someone 2/3 of Singapore pay, you pay a Malaysian 2/3 of Singapore pay, and if the person is not married to a Singaporean, if they do not have kids going to school in Singapore, very likely they'll come back to work in Malaysia. But to get Malaysian businesses to think about moving from 1/3 of Singapore pay to 2/3 of Singapore pay is a huge jump. And that's where we need to rewire and rethink our business model. We need to rethink how we see ourselves, and we need to also think of the role of incentivizing technology so that we become a technology nation. We create our own IP, we create our own products, we create value. We create value, we enhance value, and not just thinking of ourselves trading anything, including human trafficking. So I just want to stop here. I know that Professor, during our lunch, Professor raised a very interesting point about exchange rate and monetary policy. I'll let him raise it, and then we can have conversation. And I welcome your comments and conversations, and let's have a good discussion. Thank you.